there.
Hi,
We are the
Dyslexia Duo.
Each week, we sit down with amazing people, including top researchers and experts in dyslexia, powerful advocates, affected individuals, and more.
Together, we break down the myths, share real stories, highlight research and strategies to advise our listeners about this prevalent learning disability.
Come join us. Hey, Melissa.
Hey, Aimee.
So today we have a very special guest, and I'm going to let Melissa go ahead and introduce her a little bit because she did find this wonderful resource for our podcast this week.
Well, I'm excited because I've been seeing Dr. Tiffany Hogan on LinkedIn for quite a while, and I saw that recently there was a big post about her influence in DLD and dyslexia. So I am super excited to learn more from her about how these disorders interact and how I can better support my students. And I know other people would love to hear more about that as well. So, Dr. Hogan, can you share a little bit about your journey into speech and language pathology and your literacy research?
Yes, so glad to be here, Aimee and Melissa. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today. So I am a speech language pathologist by training, and my first job was working in early intervention, inpatient hospital, outpatient hospital, and in schools because I was a contractor. So I got a variety of experiences. And one thing that I noted was that the children that I saw for early speech and language difficulties would go on to have reading problems. So that led me to think more deeply about that relationship. And I hadn't had training in my graduate program on this relationship explicitly. We had touched on it, but it wasn't really clear to me. So I then obtained my PhD with Dr. Hugh Katz. And from there, it just started the journey of me being interested in these children and studying them. I've had the opportunity to work with large data sets and many family members and children with dyslexia and developmental language disorder in early speech and language difficulties and with schools that serve those children.
Wow. Were you just starstruck when you found out Dr. Katz was basically over your studies, or did you realize who he was at that time?
Yes. So I found him because I read his book, and I was starstruck because I read his book and realized he wasn't that far from me. I was in Kansas City and he was at the University of Kansas. So I picked up the phone as you did back in those days and called him, and he answered, and we struck up a conversation. It was a great match. And I got to work with him when he was delving into a really important data set of children that were followed from kindergarten all the way to 12th grade. And that is called the Iowa Study. And that's where we determined the prevalence of DLD, which was called specific language impairment at that time. And I got to work with him on that data set and really do some great analyses that we're still working on and have replicated many times since then.
Awesome.
I just wondered about the Iowa assessment that you were speaking about. Is that something similar to when I was a child, we did the Iowa test of basic skills? Is that the same thing?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that question. So the Iowa study that I'm referring to is actually a National Institutes of Health study that was funded by tax dollars to assess children with a variety of language, speech, cognitive, and reading assessments, starting in kindergarten all the way through 12th grade. And they were assessed, these same children were assessed in kindergarten, second, fourth, 8th, 10th, and 12th grade. So we have lots of studies. I think there's over 100 studies that have been conducted on those children to look at the relationship between speech, language, and literacy. And it doesn't have any relation to the Iowa test of basic skills that I know of.
Okay. Good to know.
That's a good question. Good clarification.
So, because I took that test when I was a child too, Melissa. So I'm like really curious then. Okay, so we hear about dyslexia, and I think most people, especially if they listen to this podcast, they have a pretty good understanding of what dyslexia is. But you do hear DLD and dyslexia used interchangeably. So how are they similar? How are they different?
This is a great question because they are different, but they're highly comorbid. So we know dyslexia is a difficulty in that a child is born with. It's a neurodiversity that's part of the human condition that makes it difficult for children to read words because of their brain structure and the way they're processing sounds and language. Children with DLD or developmental language disorder have a neurodiversity as well. And this neurodiversity makes it difficult for them to learn vocabulary words, grammar, and story discourse. So putting sentences together to tell complete stories. There is a high overlap between the two because they're both language learning disabilities. So we know that if a child has difficulty in vocabulary and grammar and is characterized as having developmental language disorder before learning to read, that is a very big risk factor for them to going on having dyslexia. And likewise, if a child has dyslexia and has difficulty learning to read words fluently and accurately, that is a high risk factor for them to also have developmental language disorder. But importantly, it's not a one-to-one overlap. Some children with DLD are able to learn to read words quite accurately and fluently. And some children with dyslexia have difficulty reading words, but are good at learning vocabulary and grammar. So it's not a one-to-one overlap, but it is a high overlap. And they're both learning disabilities rooted in difficulty in language.
So would you say DLD is also like, you hear dyslexia called a spectrum disorder. I know some people hate that terminology, but it's also like a spectrum disorder.
Yes, DLD is absolutely a spectrum disorder where we see difficulties in some areas and not others. And we also see a range of severity.
Okay, very good.
I think I was just kind of also intrigued by the fact that you said it's not a one-to-one correspondence. So you might see somebody with dyslexia that might have characteristics of DLD, but it's not necessarily DLD either, right? I mean, they might have
Yeah.
that problem with the vocabulary because they've not been exposed to as many words because they couldn't read the words.
Yeah, that's true, but that wouldn't be the neurodiversity part of it. So
Mhm.
it does complicate matter, as development often does, as you know.
Yes.
We're human children, right? Like it's a complicated situation in terms of how they're exposed to text and language. So children with dyslexia are definitely at risk of having lower vocabulary and less sophisticated grammar because of reading less. However, DLD is more severe in the sense that it really is a neurodiversity that the brain has difficulty learning new words. If a child with dyslexia truly has DLD, they will have difficulty learning words that they hear in the environment. And so it
Right.
won't be just that they haven't read the word, it's that they may hear it and they still have difficulty. But we also know of, and I'm sure you probably know of children who have dyslexia that have amazing vocabularies and they learn words very easily and their grammatical structure is good and they're able to tell very rich and complex stories. But the heart of their difficulty, the primary difficulty is in word reading. And that's a case where you would have a child who truly has dyslexia without DLD. And then you have children with DLD. I've studied these children with many others who really have difficulty in comprehending language, but they can read words fine. They just can't understand the language that's coming from those words. And again, it's a high overlap. We say it's about 50 to 80% overlap. So
Wow.
it is a very high overlap and it's complicated because you have a difficulty. So you could have maybe really severe, and I've seen this in children, severe dyslexia, but more of a mild DLD. So you kind of have this complicated developmental relationship between the two. And importantly, they're both really grounded in language, and language is complex in itself. Language has vocabulary, language has grammar, language has the sound processing, the phonological processing of language. It has the social piece. So language is so complex, and we see these strengths and weaknesses across language, and that influences whether a child has dyslexia and DLD or one or the other.
So I'm going to kind of go into my brain. I work with a student at my center who is not dyslexic. In fact, I was listening to her read. She reads well. She reads on grade level. She reads with prosody, but she has like no comprehension, no understanding of some of the vocab that's in the text. Could that, I mean, without making identification, because you don't know this child, could that be symptoms of DLD?
Yeah, obviously, like you said, I can't do a diagnosis with not knowing the child and having a comprehensive evaluation with the family history and such. But I will say that is pretty much what we hear when we hear children being described who have DLD only. They're kind of confusing that way because you're like, oh, when you think of reading, you often think of reading words. But we know that some children, like the child you described, can read words but have difficulty understanding language. And that would be classic representation of a child who has DLD without dyslexia.
Okay, makes sense. Now that helps me. I've just been working on vocabulary comprehension with her in the reading facet because she didn't need phonological awareness. She didn't need decoding. She didn't need fluency. She just needed those last two pillars more than anything. Interesting.
Yeah, and I think it's so important to think about, and why I'm excited to think about DLD with you. And it's something like I've studied for now over 20 years. And it's an exciting time to think about it because we're so focused on literacy instruction and we're focused on getting it right. But we know that literacy instruction involves two primary components. That's word reading and language comprehension. And if we only focus on word reading, then we're missing language comprehension. And if we only focus on word reading and think that focusing on word reading will make language comprehension okay, that's also not the case. Just like we know if you only focus on language comprehension, children aren't going to get the best instruction in word reading. So we really have to think about doing both of those systematically and explicitly. And in doing so, we have to think about evaluating children for word reading and language comprehension difficulties. And right now we're seeing a lot of evaluation and focus on word reading, which is great to mitigate and help children with dyslexia. However, I don't see that same focus on language comprehension. I'm hoping we can get that online. And that means we would have early identification and screening for language problems. We would have progress monitoring for language. We would have systematic explicit instruction in language.
I think that's important. And I think that's an important message to bring out. And because in the dyslexia therapy world, we do print to speech to print, but then a lot of our therapists think, okay, I've done the meat of the curriculum, and they leave out that verbal expression. And I truly feel like the PA and the decoding and the fluency, that's the low-hanging fruit. You have to get to the other side, in my opinion, to make it all come together.
Absolutely. And writing is important for this too. When we're talking about language comprehension, we've got the oral language comprehension and we have the written comprehension and we have the oral language expression and the written expression. And that's really tied together with the writing and language.
Interesting.
You had mentioned early, but of course there has to be identification first. But what do you think, just even thinking about a child from, birth or even the first few years of life, what are some of the key things that need to happen in order to develop one's language and or identify if there's a concern?
Yeah, so we have research from all over the world thinking about this early identification of language difficulties. And even though DLD is a newer term, the children have been studied for over 100 years. I think there was an article, I need to check this, 200 years that we have a history of these children being documented and studying them. And so this is part of the human condition of having difficulty learning language. So what we know from that plethora of research is that children who are having difficulty with language learning, they're late talkers. So they're children who, Mabel Rice describes this. She's a researcher out of Kansas who studied DLD for many generations. And she describes it as the train leaving the station late. So what we know is that they start language development late and they oftentimes stay late, but they follow the same train track or the same trajectory of learning, which is helpful for us when we think about how to stimulate language. It's not that we have to do something radically different. It means that we have to do more stimulation of what we would typically see. And so some of the things that you can do to early identify is really pay attention if a child is not meeting developmental markers for language. So one of them is having 50 words at age 2 and 2-word combinations. So if a child doesn't have 50 words at age 2 and they have no 2-word combinations, that's the definition of a late talker. And so what's tricky about late talking is about 75% of children who are late talkers, they do grow out of it. They catch up. But the 25% that don't, they're the ones that go on and have DLD or some other language difficulty, whether it be DLD and dyslexia or autism or speech sound disorder, they have difficulties that need to be attended to. So we need to be really incorporating that into our system with pediatricians, with early interventionists to think about how do we determine what are the language markers that children are meeting. And if they're not meeting them, we can intervene early. And one of the first things we do is we train parents on how to get high quality language discussions with their child. And we know that it's not necessarily always about just the words they hear, but it's about the exchange. So trying to get the back and forth to language is critically important.
What age would you suggest that they start with parents, with their children?
Well, it's never too early. Children are developing language even in utero. When they're born, they're able to detect the language patterns that they've heard. So reading to children, even from birth, with child-friendly books and just sitting there. I read to my children literally from birth. They were babies, and it's a nice routine to get into where you just spend that quality time snuggling and reading. It gives you a way to talk to them, but it's not just with reading books, it's everyday interactions. So interactions around food, interactions at bath time, interactions in the car, taking a walk at the playground, just having these interactions. And it has to be really organic and natural. It's about the social connection, because language is really the social connection. So it's sharing in an experience, labeling the experience, talking it through, and having that social connection.
Or to like, oh, do you see that bird flying? The kid says, yes. What color is the bird? Something that back and forth.
Exactly,
Okay.
exactly. And really taking the child's lead. So the child points something out, you kind of go with the child's focus as opposed to like taking them away from their focus is very helpful. But you have to keep in mind, neurodiversity, something that a child's born with. So I want to be careful that we don't have the message that parents can just talk to their child a lot and they won't have DLD, because we know from children with dyslexia, you can read to them all you want, and that doesn't mean it's going to cure their dyslexia. They need systematic, explicit instruction. So to put it all on the parents for language development would be remiss on our part. We know that if a child has difficulty, they need to get that systematic, explicit instruction by a professional, preferably a speech language pathologist, or a teacher in their classroom has been trained on language. And ideally, everyone around their environment would know how to really stimulate their language, but it's not just all on the parents, because they can talk to their child all they want. But if a child has DLD, they're going to need some explicit and systematic instruction.
That's good to know.
I can remember I watched it. It was a few months back. I watched the documentary, and I cannot remember if it was Right to Read or something different, but I know Kareem Weaver was in it. And the documentary followed a parent with a child that was like really young. And I remember the little girl's name was Ivy. And the mom was pointing to the alphabet letters and she was talking. She goes, we're going to eat strawberries. And Ivy would try to say strawberries. And you would see her over the years and you could just see how her language grew because the parents talk to her about everything. They'd go shopping and they would be talking. And the mom evidently went to school and I think she became a teacher, and Ivy ended up going, I think they stopped her at age 6. I think that following in the documentary, but it was just so neat to see how that verbal support really helped Ivy in her language development. It was really interesting. And I think so many times parents think that, just talking about the mundane is unimportant, but it is important that we're going to eat the strawberries. We're going to chop the strawberries. It's going to throw our food in trash that we're not going to, we'll save it. I don't know, that we're not going to eat. It's interesting. It was really interesting to see that pathway over time.
And I think we also have to consider the whole family, like the whole family has to be supported. For parents to be able to have the time and energy and resources to actually do that, they have to have housing security, food security. They have to have mental health support. There has to be a lot of wraparound community support for families to be able to stimulate language, like you mentioned for Ivy.
Yeah, interesting. So a lot of people think, and we know now definition from IDA, that it's so much more than just a deficit in phonological processing, but that's what the people would hang their hats on when they're doing a dyslexia identification. Oh, they can't be dyslexic because there's not a deficit in phonological processing, right? So many people think it's a deficit only in phonological processing, but you kind of talk a little bit about broader language connections. So how does language comprehension interact with dyslexic profiles?
Yeah, great question. So, we know the hallmark of dyslexia is not being able to learn to read words accurately and fluently after having some exposure to word reading instruction. So that's really the key, whether it's driven by a phonological deficit or a more global language deficit. What is that driven by? That's what the comprehensive evaluation should determine. And so we know that there's multiple pathways that can lead to problems in word reading. And it probably is likely a cumulative effect. So we have the risk and resilience cumulative model, which is by Hugh Katz and Yaakov Petcher, where they really do talk about this idea that it's going to be accumulation. So what we found in our research is that we find some children who have phonological deficits that don't manifest dyslexia because they have some other areas that they're actually excelling in, like maybe language comprehension that can really compensate, or orthographic processing that can compensate for that. We also know that there's children who have dyslexia, but they don't have a clear phonological deficit. And it's likely that it's something other, like an orthographic processing or connecting letters and sounds, processing speed. There's other kinds of factors. So I think for us, we have to have a more nuanced view of the cumulative factors that can lead to dyslexia. And as practitioners, we want to do a comprehensive evaluation to ultimately better understand all of the characteristics of the child. And in particular, do they have language comprehension difficulties? Because that's going to mean they're going to need extra instruction in language that is above and beyond the systematic explicit word reading instruction.
So, because I'm thinking about the screener piece, because like in Texas, we have early screeners, mandatory screeners for dyslexia, kinder and first grade, right? Into kindergarten, middle of first grade. If you were to create a screener, what would be on that screener? And you would probably do it at an early age, I would imagine. But what would you like to see on a screener?
Yeah, that's a great question too, because we've done a lot of research in the area of screening. And what we found is that you can't screen for only word reading problems and expect to find language problems. We have to directly screen language. What would that look like? There's lots of different options, actually. And we have a paper that's open access where we review screeners that are available for DLD. And there's a wide range of ways to get at the risk for DLD. And it really depends on your school setting, the types of children that you're seeing, what age they are. And you can do vocabulary screeners, you can do teacher and parent questionnaires. They have to be concocted and very well established to work with teachers and parents, because teachers and parents often miss the signs of language difficulty. It's easy to miss those. So I wouldn't say any parent or teacher questionnaire, but one that has been really truly tested to be good at picking up on DLD. There's measures of non-sentence repetition is a one that's been showing a lot of promise. So asking children to repeat sentences, and if they have difficulty, that's an indicator that they might have DLD. We have response to intervention, which is another key factor where you ask them to do these tasks over time. And if they're not learning language like you would expect, that's a sign that they're not picking up on the vocabulary in the classroom. There's also measures of story retell, which are showing a lot of promise, where a child listens to a short story and retells the story in the best, most elaborate way they can. And that's a really good indicator. But all of these measures have to be done in a systematic way, administered by the guidelines, to then have confidence that they're going to be picking up on risk for DLD. And we need to see that alongside the word reading measures that we give.
That's really interesting, because I do story retelling with some of my kids, and they are kids with dyslexia, and we know the overlap is there. And some of them can remember the details. They can go in chronological order. And some of them are like, there was a boy and he was in the kitchen, and that's all I get from them. And you're like, okay. Can you remember anything else?
Flag. Yeah, big red flag for having DLD, because they're not able to put it in the right order, state those details, recall those details, and produce them. That's a big risk factor.
So is there a way for these screeners to identify ADHD? Like, is ADHD also coexistent with DLD as much as it is with dyslexia? And is there a way to identify, exclude one or the other?
Yeah, that's a great question. It is a higher overlap as well. And there's a lot of great research out there on ways to separate out DLD versus ADHD, ADHD versus dyslexia, dyslexia versus DLD, but not a lot that are putting all three together. We have a paper we published a couple of years ago that was led by my colleague, Norma Hancock, and we did all three. And what we found is that they all, again, it's kind of this overlap thing. So there's a high overlap, but some children had one. I mean, only had ADHD. We can think of those kids who only have ADHD. They don't have dyslexia. They don't have DLD. We know there's children who only have dyslexia, only have DLD. But if you have one neurodiversity, the chances of you having another one goes up quite a bit. And so if a child has one difficulty, we should be comprehensively evaluating them for all the other difficulties that we would need to consider.
I watched a continuing education with Dr. Lucker, who's also a speech language pathologist. I guess you probably have heard of him, maybe. But he talked about auditory processing disorder, but more on the integration side. And it, to me, is fascinating because I think about how when you talked about all three, that makes me wonder, is that more of the integration of all of those pieces is where there might be the mix up?
Yeah, I think that's a great point because we know that some of those underlying psychological processes like integration and processing speed really do have a big impact on whether a child has one neurodiversity or another. So yeah, it's very important. And back to your question about early identification of ADHD, we have early identification measures that can be given to determine ADHD in the form of parent and teacher questionnaires. And I think we need to think about screening for that as well. I know in Massachusetts, where I am, it's routine for pediatricians to ask parents at their yearly wellness check those questions about ADHD, and they're really on top of it to get a referral if needed. But that's not happening in every state. I think that's pretty rare, actually. So the more integrated we can be in terms of our school system and our medical systems, wherever we see children, it's good to be asking these questions for early identification across the spectrum for autism, ADHD, DLD, dyslexia, because we know early intervention is really powerful.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
It seems
for
like it
sure.
could be an easy thing for pediatricians, for the National Association of Pediatricians to take on and do more with that. I'm sure I got their
Interesting.
name wrong, so I'm sorry, pediatrician people.
Pediatrician people. Okay.
Yes.
And now, a word from our sponsor.
Hey, Melissa.
Hey, Amy.
So let's talk about who we met at IDA, Tumbleweed.
Oh, I love Tumbleweed's decodable books, and they're for striving readers in grades 2 through 6. My favorite thing about them, in addition to the storylines, is the inclusion of comprehension, spelling, and vocabulary activities.
Yes, and there's no guessing because they took out the visual distractions. They still have illustrations, but not right next to the print.
And Tumbleweed is easy to implement with any core or intervention program. Their teacher guides are jam-packed with multimodal approaches.
Check them out at tumbleweedpublishing.com. Hi, this is Aimee Rodenroth, and as part of the Dyslexia Duo Podcast team and owner of Discovery Dyslexia Services, I want to talk to you about my business. Our COUT-trained team offers expert virtual or in-person therapy located in Prosper, Texas, using proven dyslexia curricula like Take Flight, Build, MTA, Alphabetic Phonics, and Reading by Design. We also provide crucial independent evaluations and advocacy services. Don't wait. Empower your child today. Visit www.discovereed.com to learn more. That again is www.discovereed.com. Discovereed, covering all your dyslexia needs. Let's return to the show. So, what does the current research tell us about effective interventions for children who struggle with both decoding and language comprehension? Or have you seen any promising curriculums or approaches or recommendations that you could suggest to our audience possibly?
So what the research tells us is that we need systematic explicit instruction in each of them. So it's not enough to just give systematic explicit instruction in word reading. And we know there's lots of curricula out there that do that and have some research support. So that's great. Now, what needs to come online is there's research in explicit systematic instruction in language that can make improvements in language. What I'm not seeing is that has been fully integrated into curriculum yet. So we have ourselves, I was part of a large research group where we created a curriculum and we did a randomized control trial, which is the gold standard to see if it works. We trained teachers. They gave this curriculum for a year in their classroom, 30 minutes a day, 4 days a week, for children pre-K to grade 3. And then we have had teachers that didn't do it. So we had kind of like the business as usual. They weren't getting the stimulation, and then they got the stimulation. And we published that work in 2 different papers showing that we were able to make improvements in language in that year. And now we're doing follow-up studies to see if we can really extrapolate that for small group instruction and see if we can have lasting effects. There's work out of the UK that has shown that you can make lasting effects by doing systematic explicit instruction in language. And so I've had the opportunity to work with some publishing companies that are really trying to infuse that research into published curriculums, because that's the next step, is we have to get it into the hands of teachers.
What kind of gains did you see in that study?
We saw some great gains. We saw gains in vocabulary. That was the highest gains. And what we showed is that, especially in grade 1, 2, and 3, if children learned vocabulary words that we taught, if they learned those words, they were more likely to have gains in language comprehension and in reading comprehension. And then we saw gains in, inferencing, the ability to make inferences, to fill in those gaps in text. We saw improvements in comprehension monitoring, or the ability to really ask yourself and monitor, is this text making sense to me? So we saw some improvements in multiple areas of language. And again, it's really a problem now in an evidence to practice gap, the research to practice gap, where we have the research showing it works, but now we got to get into the hands of teachers and educators and SLPs in the schools. And there's a lot of progress in that way. There's lots of companies that are going online, and I think getting that research out there.
How difficult is it to train multiple teachers and SLPs in something like that? Because I know as teachers, a lot of us have autonomy with how we go through a curriculum. And if you're trying to replicate research, you don't want them to put too much of their own personal spin on some of this. So how difficult was something like that?
It was difficult, but we worked very closely with teachers when we developed the curriculum. And I think that's a key part of what I wish publishers would do more of, is work directly with teachers to really understand how they're going to learn a certain curriculum, what works for them, what doesn't. And we focus on Fidelity. So we learned from teachers that they wanted some scripting. So our lessons had scripting to help them learn, like, what are the exact verbiage that I can use to teach these skills? And then over time, they could do a little less of the script, or they could have less tied to the exact script. But what we did is we measured. We would watch videos or go into the classroom and watch them and say, oh, you're doing this right, you're doing this right, or this is something you're missing in the curriculum. We have the kind of key components we need. And we saw there was a range of fidelity. Some teachers were better at giving it than others. And that fidelity is something that we have to try to adhere to. But we also need to make sure that the materials help teachers to do the lessons well.
That sounds very familiar to what Melissa and I do in our dyslexia therapy. We have a curriculum, and in order to replicate the success of that curriculum, they have to hold it to the fidelity components. It's scripted. It's supposed to be delivered in a certain amount of time in a similar fashion across the board, so that if you have a child that transfer from one campus to another campus receiving that same curriculum, it's going to be identical.
And that's what we want too in our language. We want that same level of specificity and adherence to language instruction. That's what we need to see. And I think it's coming online. We see a lot of curriculum now that are focused on knowledge and improving knowledge, and knowledge is learned through language. And you have to have something to talk about. That's the knowledge. And you have to have language to share the knowledge. So as we get those knowledge curriculums focused more on explicit instruction and language, and we get language curriculum to focus more on knowledge, we're going to see a great marriage. And that's going to be helpful for children and teachers to learn how to actually explicitly, systematically teach language.
I love all the adjectives.
Are you saying that you're working on a program wherein there would be instruction on oral language, phonics, vocabulary, retell, any of those types of activities? Is that what you're saying you're doing, or is that something that's up and coming?
Oh, no, that's what we did. And we showed the evidence with the randomized control trial that it worked. We focused on vocabulary, grammar, inferencing, comprehension monitoring, and story grammar, knowing the components of a story. And we did it in expository and fiction. And we showed that it worked. Now we just have to get it actually into schools as a systematic practice. One way we've been thinking about that, and there's research showing that this works, is that we have to do an MTSS program with language. So when we think about multi-tiered systems of support for word reading, we think about a screening, progress monitoring, tier 1 instruction, tier 2, tier 3. We are working on that with language. And when we do that, we do see gains for children. We identify them early. We progress monitor how well they're learning the vocabulary, grammar, and higher level language skills that we're teaching. And if they aren't doing well, we give them small group instruction. And if they need, then they receive a qualification for an IEP. We need to have that level of specificity for language. And when we see that level of specificity for language, we see that there's major gains in language, and we'll see that for reading comprehension.
That sounds amazing. I think that this would be life-changing for so many people. And especially when you shot us with that number of 50 to 80% also are comorbid with dyslexia. It is just mind-boggling to me that, we could potentially change that many more lives with this type of program. And especially thinking about how schools run. Aimee and I both were in public education, so we're very familiar with how schools run. And if it could be implemented with Fidelity and give those teachers that support that they need to have the lesson handed to them, and they can just put their little magic touch on it and deliver, it would be wonderful.
Yeah, and we get a lot of feedback. It's really fun. I mean, language is fun, right? You're talking with children, you're learning, you're having these great discussions, you're making these connections with the children, and children are making connections with themselves. I think what's also shocking is that we know from research that is originally from the Iowa data 30 years ago, and even as recent as a couple of years ago, unfortunately, only about 20% of children with DLD are ever identified for services. And that means that we have over 600,000 kindergartners this year alone that have DLD, and they are never getting the support they need. And what we find with these children is they often go on to be characterized as late emerging poor readers, where they're kids who they seem to do okay, and then they hit 3rd or 4th grade and they hit into that slump. And it's like, oh, now they're struggling because the text is harder. But when we look at our data, we show they always had language problems, but no one was assessing that. So these are not late emerging, they're late identified, and we miss that critical period. And some children never get identified, and they're misclassified as behavioral difficulties. They're classified as being immature or emotionally immature, and they really struggle throughout their lifetime. And we know long-term, if you don't receive support services for language, you're more likely to be unemployed, you're more likely to have contact with the police, and your risk of suicide is higher. We really are changing lives by focusing on language and supporting these children.
Absolutely. And I do have another question too about what I run into for myself is we're trying to get kids to be able to decode words so they could be able to read. I know how important and vocabulary instruction is as well, but trying to fit that into just 1 hour, I have a hard time with. So I guess my question to you, and I know it's not just vocabulary, but just in general, language rich activities. How do you recommend people like me incorporate more of those language rich activities into, say, a dyslexia curriculum where we're focused on decoding?
I think that this is a great example of where the IDA really comes in and provides some nice guidance with their structured literacy guidance, because they're trying to integrate more of word reading and language. And for instance, when we think about vocabulary, we know that vocabulary words have multiple inputs. One, you can read the word, you can write the word, you can say the word, and you have the meaning of the word. And when we do all 4 of those together, when we tie that together, we create a stronger representation. So really thinking through, if we're reading words and we're getting the exposure we need for word reading, attaching meaning to those words, if they're real words, we would attach meaning, but also we want to make sure that we're not, with children with dyslexia, limiting their language by what they can read. So audiobooks are great, reading aloud to these children, making sure they have access to language that's age appropriate, that isn't limited by their word reading. So it really is this, how do we provide the focus we need on word reading and language and writing, but also how do we integrate them? So I'm going to give you a very clear example. So one way to integrate them is that in a lesson where we're focusing on vocabulary, we may then go to writing, and we're going to do our writing curriculum. And in the writing curriculum, we would want to tell children, don't forget to use the words that we talked about in our language lesson. You can use those words in your writing. So that kind of thing, right? Or, you're doing a reading and maybe you're using a decodable, which is pretty limited in language, but you see a word in there and you're like, maybe the word is rose, and because you're working on silent E and you had a lesson on flowers. So you're like, oh, rose, that is actually a flower. Remember we talked about flowers and different flowers. So, there's ways to integrate along the way, but when we do integrate, we want to be careful not to pull away from the depth and repetition and dosage we need for word reading and for language on its own as well.
Interesting. And, I can remember my first year I taught back in the Stone Age, I had a group of sixth graders and we were doing novel studies. And one of the things we were doing was taking the vocab words out of the novels and they had to write it, look up the word, they didn't know it, and use it in a sentence that demonstrated that they understood what the word was, like the word obsolete. And I remember I had kids that obviously were demonstrating they didn't know what the word obsolete was because their sentence was, I was very obsolete. And I'm like, okay, you're not showing me you know what that means. And so we had to do a whole focus on when you write a sentence that's showing me what it means, you put it in a particular example setting, whatever, that demonstrates your understanding. And so that's kind of what that was making me think of. And that was with sixth graders back 30 something years ago. And I still see kids do that to this point now. But going back to a connection that I had when I first started doing dyslexia in public ed, I used to talk to my SLP. We were always next door. We were always the little rooms next door to each other on our campus, right?
Yes.
And for some reason, we're both supposed to have very quiet environments. We're always next door to the bathroom with the hand dryer, but I digress, Anyway, but I used to talk to her a lot about our kids that we shared for articulation. But now for DLD, we should be talking to our speech pathologists in our schools a lot more than just for articulation purposes.
100%. I think that there's a lot of untapped resource there in a speech language pathologist who knows the details of language. I will say, as a speech language pathologist and working with speech language pathologists, we also have a caseload problem. They have very high caseloads. They're not well funded, and there's many children on the caseload that they have to attend to outside of language. And so they often have to see those kids who have articulation difficulties, and our scope of practice is so broad. But even having said that, the more we can collaborate with speech language pathologists to support children in language and literacy, the better.
Good. I love it.
Yeah, I wish I would have done a better job recognizing, tapping in on that when I was in public education a little bit more. I just didn't realize how great of a relationship we could have had. I mean, not that I didn't get along with the person, but just really working hand in hand with those teachers, especially regarding my own students, but even helping with dyslexia side with the SLP and she teaching me about what she's got expertise in.
That's not on you, Melissa. That's on the system. I think we need to create systems in schools that allow more collaboration and set aside the time and energy to do so. So hopefully we can think more about that collaboration time and build that into our day and our workload.
I love that idea. We never had team meetings where specialists would break out and work together on identifying kids that had weaknesses.
Right.
Yeah. So I know we're getting close to the end, but I also wanted to know what kind of steps should some parents take if they see signs of language delays? What kind of steps should they take early on to try to get their kid going in the right direction with both spoken and written language? Is there any kind of pretest, any kind of something that they need to do other than going to the pediatrician? I know that's what you recommended before. Anything else?
Yes. So I think parents, if they have concerns about language, they should reach out to their pediatrician if that's the avenue. They can also reach out to their local school district because school districts are required to do assessments. And also they have a lot of ways, and states have varied supports for early identification in birth to 3. So we should have access in your state to these resources. So reaching out and tapping into those taxpayer funded resources for children is important, and really trying to get a comprehensive evaluation from a speech language pathologist and literacy specialists. Ideally, you'd have one person that has both training, but getting a team-based approach as well works. And really trying to determine what is the individual differences of that child, and then what is the best support services in that child's environment.
Very good. Very
That's
good.
helpful.
So, kind of wrapping up, what recommendations do you have for parents and therapists, teachers, anyone who might have some questions and want to learn more?
Oh, great. I'm so glad you asked me that, because I was just realizing one thing I left out is that we have a great resource online called DLD and Me. And if they search DLD and Me, we have this website that has lots of information about DLD in short, parent-friendly format. And when you go into the resources section, we have it laid out like, if you're a teacher, here's some resources for you. If you're an SLP, here's resources for you. If you're a parent, here's resources for you. If you're a person who thinks they have DLD, here's resources for you. And we have infographics. We have informational sheets you can print out to give family, to give teachers. And we also have, importantly, videos of parents and children sharing their lived experience. There's also a website called Empower DLD. That is a group of parents that are learning about DLD, and they have a really amazing, I think it's called a vodcast instead of podcast. It's a video. Video of two children talking about DLD, and we're starting to do some collaboration with them, and it's quite amazing. They have an online community. So there's a lot of resources. Rattle is another great resource, RADLD. It's raising awareness of DLD. Great website to learn more about DLD. So lots of great resources out there to learn about DLD in a parent-friendly and educator-friendly way, and then to start building community around DLD.
I love it.
Okay. And then please forgive me if you've answered this before. If people needed to get some treatment for DLD, is that directly through speech language pathology right now until you get this new
Yes.
program up and running? Okay.
Yes, great question. It's through a speech language pathologist or a reading specialist who has training in language. There's some of those as well. So yes. And also I should mention, I have my own podcast, See, Hear, Speak podcast. I've really let it go in the last couple of years because I've been a guest on podcasts, but I'm hoping to restart that. I have lots of episodes about DLD.
And what's it called again?
See, Hear, Speak.
See, Hear, Speak. That sounds great.
Love it.
Okay. And then where can listeners learn more about your work other than See, Hear, Speak?
Yeah, so I'm on all the socials, Tiffany P. Hogan, and I'm have a website at MGH Institute of Health Professions where I am a professor, so they can reach out that way.
Great.
Awesome. Okay, so we have lightning round questions. Don't think, just say it. Ready?
Yep.
Okay. Phonology of vocabulary, which deserves more attention in early elementary?
Both.
Oh. Okay.
And if you could have dinner with any historical figure in language or literacy research, who would you pick and why?
Oh, that's a really hard one. I'm not supposed to think, but I was just looking up here at Bloom and Leahy, who in the 1970s created the taxonomy for language. So either one of them would be great.
All
Awesome.
right. That's great.
Okay, what's your elevator pitch to describe DLD to a stranger?
DLD is when a child has difficulty understanding or using language. They're born with this difficulty and they need your support.
Good elevator pitch. Like it.
Okay. One change you'd make to teacher prep programs.
I would have teachers learn about the complexity of language and how it affects all academic outcome, not just reading, but science, social studies, and everything that they learn.
I agree.
Biggest red flag for language comprehension weakness in a classroom?
Oh, there's so many things I'm thinking about. A child who often looks around when they're given instructions to see what everyone else is doing.
I've noticed that too. That's a good one.
Okay. And then final lightning takeaway for our listeners. One sentence. What should every educator remember about language and literacy?
Children spend the majority of their waking hours in schools, and you can be a big difference in their long-term life trajectory.
Exactly right.
Love that. I love that.
I just said that to a parent today.
This is amazing. I'm so glad that you took the time to meet with us. You have been a wealth of information, really opened up my eyes to DLD. And I have done so much learning. So I hope that this can be like a professional development as well, like credit wise. You just taught me so much, so I appreciate it. I hope other listeners as well could learn a lot from you. So
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure talking to both of you and learning about all you've been doing for so long for children, and I appreciate you.
Oh, thank you for coming. Again, thank you for giving up your time. I know
yes.
can be a little tough sometimes.
And now I'm on to meet with a student again.
Oh,
there
how
you go. Okay. All right. So we're going to sign off. This is Aimee,
and Melissa.
and we're the Dyslexia Duo. Until next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
The Dyslexia Duo hosts are Melissa Dean.
And Aimee Rodenroth. The producer is Greg Rodenroth.
Dyslexia awareness is so important. Please share with your friends, family, and anyone who needs to know more about dyslexia.
Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and X at the Dyslexia Duo.
Thanks for listening.
Bye.